Well, hello and welcome to week 5, Expansion, Progress, and the Meaning of America. The title of the chapter in your book is Freedom and Revival. So I just want to start by reminding you that while we have focused quite a bit on Puritan New England the last few weeks, this doesn't mean that Puritan New England was representative of all that was happening in America at the time. In fact, in many ways, it was very different from the rest of America. So this week we'll branch out a little more to hopefully see some of those differences. As we move into the early 19th century, you'll see that it was a period of immense change in the United States. Economic, political, demographic, and territorial transformations radically altered how Americans thought about themselves, their communities, and their rapidly expanding nation. It was a period of great optimism, with the possibilities of self-governance infusing everything from religion to politics. But it was also a period of great conflict as the benefits of industrialization and democratization increasingly accrued along starkly uneven lines of gender, race, and class. And westward expansion distanced urban dwellers from frontier settlers more than ever before. And so while the spread of democracy opened up the franchise to nearly all white men, urbanization and a dramatic influx of European migration increased social tension and class divides. And Americans in general looked upon these challenges with a mixture of enthusiasm and suspicion, wondering how the moral fabric of the new nation would hold up to emerging social challenges. As we'll see in the next few weeks, many turned to two powerful tools to help understand and manage the various transformation, and these tools were spiritual revivalism and social reform. And so, reacting to the rationalism of the 18th century Enlightenment, the religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening reignited Protestant spirituality during the early 19th century, which is the time period we are looking at this week. The Second Great Awakening remade the nation's religious landscape as revivalist preachers traveled on horseback, sharing the message of spiritual and moral renewal to as many as possible. And so to begin your weekly materials, I've added a short video which helps explain the origins and ideas of the Second Great Awakening, just as kind of a refresher for you. I've also included a map of what was called the Burned Over District. This refers to the area along the Erie Canal in New York, where many religious leaders sought to spur revival during the Second Great Awakening. And the most well-known evangelist, as you will hear in the video, was Charles Finney. And he gave this area this name because of its continual exposure to the hellfire and brimstone religious teachings of the day. And there were certain particular religious groups that were founded in this area, which included the Mormon Church, the Millerites, and the Shakers. And this Western New York area was also known for many social reform movements like abolition, women's rights, and temperance. So there's a lot going on in this particular area as we begin to branch out of New England. I have included a letter from James Madison to Edward Livingston, dated July 10th, 1882, in which he talks about the importance of the separation of church and state, or as he puts it, separation between ecclesiastical and civil matters. So you can see the original letter, but if I were you, I would click on the text option at the top of the page to make for easier reading. And before we begin to branch out, we'll start with your primary source in New England by looking at Isaac Backus. And Backus was a leading Baptist preacher during the era of the Revolution. He was considered a leading orator, and he published a sermon in 1773 which articulated his desire for religious liberty and a separation of church and state. So I think it's important for you to kind of take a look at what he had to say about that. He's become identified as part of this movement which led to the formation of a large number of separate or New Light churches. And just on a side note, the New Light versus Old Light terms, they can be a little bit confusing, and so I just kind of want to break it down for you. And the New Light perspective is often associated with the Great Awakening, marked by enthusiastic preaching and emphasis on inner conversion. The beliefs of the New Lights of the first Great Awakening competed with the more conservative religion of the first colonists, who are known as the Old Lights. And some categorize this division between Old and New Lights, with the Old Lights being those adherents to the more traditional, unemotional faith, and the New Lights being the subscribers to a new, more passionate and personal religiosity. Of course, this is very much an oversimplification of a varied and multifaceted theological schism or schisms, but I just wanted you to kind of have an easy working definition as you go through this. So you'll take a closer kind of a case study look at Shaker leader Mother Ann Lee. I've assigned you a journal article. It's rather long, but I feel it's important for you to think about how different and varied religions functioned in America and also how they changed over time. And so I'm hoping a case study will help you think about this and other groups that are arising at this time and how their own theology changed over the course of a few generations. And I also hope this journal article gives you a chance to see how historians use primary sources to construct their own interpretation of events. So look at the footnotes and see what Tisa Wegner has used as her sources. Think about the types of sources that you have been looking at and how you might present your findings in a particular journal. By the 1830s, a rising tide of anti-colonization sentiment among northern free Black Americans and middle-class evangelicals flourished, with a focus on a commitment to social reform. And we have Baptists such as William Lloyd Garrison, congregational revivalists like Arthur and Lewis Tappan and Theodore Weld, as well as radical Quakers including Lucretia Mott and John Greenleaf Whittier, were pushing the idea of this immediate emancipation onto the center stage for Northern reform agendas. They were inspired by a strategy known as moral suasion, and these abolitionists believed they could convince slaveholders to voluntarily release their slaves by appealing to their sense of Christian conscience. So I want to go back a little bit and look at Richard Allen, and he was born in 1760. He was a minister, educator, writer, and one of America's most active and influential Black leaders. In 1794, he founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and this was the first independent Black denomination in the United States. I've included a video which explains his ministry and life, as well as a primary source written by Richard Allen to help you understand his contribution to religion in America. And I particularly want you to think about his act of writing this book and the reasoning behind it. So think about that as you go through the reading. Then I'll have you move on to Jarena Lee. She's likely one of the first African-American female preachers in America. She was, in fact, inspired by Richard Allen. And I've included some links for you to look at and try to understand her life. And I also want you to keep in mind the differences in the different lived experiences of Northern African-Americans and Southern slaves. And I've put a couple of links to some songs for you to listen to, because I think it's important for you to understand how important in terms of the Southern slaves these songs were for their religious worship. And they were, they ranged from work songs to folk tales and a varied mix of recreational songs. But the one particular type of song I've included are called field hollers. And these were sung by Southern slaves to accompany their work or to communicate or vent their feelings. And it differs from the collective work song in that it was typically sung solo, though early observers noted that a holler or a cry might be echoed by other workers. And it's closely related to the call and responsive work songs, and ultimately influenced strands of African American music such as the spirituals and blues. And I just have given you a couple of links to look at. Certainly, if you're more interested, you can go on to YouTube and find many more of those songs. I've also included a document of the religious practice of enslaved African Americans, and these are selections from WPA interviews in 1936 and 1938. So you can hear from people themselves about what the religious practices were in the South. So those links are on Blackboard for you to look at. And then next you'll move on and look at William Miller. He was born in 1782, and he was an American religious enthusiast and a leader of a movement called Millerism. And that movement sought to revive the belief that the bodily arrival or advent of Christ was imminent. And I've provided a link, specifically a link to the William Miller collection at the Center for the Adventist Research, for the purpose of having you look and think about how historians do research in archives. And so I've linked to what is called a finding aid, and it's a description of the archival material. So if you go into an archive and you want to look something up or you want to find it, there's a huge, well, depending on the archive, some are small, but there are so many different materials that it's necessary to categorize them and have you look at the finding aid and let them know what you'd like them to pull for you to look at while you're doing your research. And it also includes such things as the provenance of the item, meaning the record of its ownership and where it's come from, an inventory of all the items available, and the location so that the person working at the archive can easily locate that for you. So when you go to do research in any archive, you'll most likely have a finding tool like this, and they have them. They're in the archive, but they're also available online, so you can look at it before you even go to the archive and see if there's that particular research material is located there before you actually physically go to the location. So I thought that was kind of a nice way to show you what's available for William Miller and also get you used to looking at what a finding aid would be. And I have a couple of links for to just kind of help you look at William Miller and his life, and those are on Blackboard. So I also have a link for you to look at Walt Whitman and think about his poetry, in particular the book Leaves of Grass, and really thinking about the link between religion and poetry. Or have you ever thought of the idea of reading poetry as a sacred text? And this link that I've provided kind of delves into that. And finally, thinking about Catholics in the United States and the idea of Americanization, and this has become a matter of increasing contemporary concern at the time, so much so that Pope Leo XIII sends Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore a letter in expressing his concerns about Americanism. And so while he lavishes praise on America and American Catholicism, he cautions against things like divorce and secret societies and the ever kind of present idea of the American style separation of church and state, which he disagrees with and does not see as an ideal arrangement. And so you have his letter written to Cardinal James, and you can look at that for yourself. And that will conclude the lesson for the week. That is the last link. I'll post the questions for lesson 5 on the discussion board by the end of tomorrow. I also hope you've had a chance to start reading your book, American Christians and Islam. I think this will add some more depth to some of the material that we're looking at, as well as the textbook. So I thank you, and I will talk to you soon.